The elderly archbishop was halfway through his sacred Latin vows when Caleb suddenly dropped my trembling hands. I looked up, meeting the cold and completely unapologetic gaze of the arrogant duke I had loved for 2 long years. "I cannot marry you before the eyes of God, Elena," Caleb announced, his voice echoing loudly through the silent, cavernous stone cathedral. A collective gasp ripped through the hundreds of elite lords and ladies seated in the polished wooden pews. My heart stopped beating in my chest, but I stubbornly refused to let a single tear fall from my eyes. He turned his back on me without a second thought, reaching his hand toward the front row of the gathered nobility. A petite blonde woman stepped forward from the shadows, a sickeningly smug smile playing on her delicate lips. "Mia is the only woman who holds my true heart," Caleb declared boldly, pulling the low-born girl tightly into his arms. He kissed her right in front of the holy altar, completely defiling our grand, meticulously planned royal ceremony. The sheer humiliation burned like the heat of a blacksmith's forge flowing rapidly through my frozen veins. I was 22, known throughout the realm as the brilliant tactical mind that had actually secured his dukedom. I had sacrificed my own youth and bled on muddy battlefields to build a flawless future for the man I thought was my destiny. Now, I was standing in a useless, heavy gown of velvet and pearls, being discarded like an old, broken sword. The wealthy barons and duchesses began to whisper maliciously, their pitying and mocking eyes burning into my exposed skin. "Poor Elena, she won his wars but lost his bed," an older countess muttered loudly from the third row. "She will have absolutely nothing left without the protection of the Silverwood banner," another voice sneered from the dimly lit arches. Caleb finally broke the kiss and looked back at me with a sickening display of fake, patronizing sympathy. "You can still remain within the castle walls, Elena," he offered smoothly, adjusting the heavy fur collar of his ceremonial cloak. "You can serve as Mia's personal lady-in-waiting and teach her the proper ways of courtly etiquette," he added ruthlessly. He was plunging the dagger of betrayal deep into my pride and slowly twisting the blade with a polite smile. My hands clenched into tight fists at my sides, crumpling the incredibly expensive white silk of my wedding gown. I did not scream, I did not cry, and I certainly did not beg for his pathetic, fickle affection. I simply reached up and tore the heavy, diamond-encrusted lace veil from my braided hair with ruthless force. The delicate fabric ripped violently, the sound incredibly sharp and shocking in the uncomfortably quiet, holy room. "I would rather rot in the darkest dungeon than serve your little mistress," I stated, my voice completely steady and cold. Caleb's face flushed with sudden, ugly anger at my blatant public defiance in front of his newly conquered vassals. "Guards, seize my former betrothed and drag her from my sight," he roared furiously, pointing a trembling, ringed finger at me. Before his armored knights could take a single step toward me, the massive, iron-reinforced oak doors of the cathedral crashed open. The heavy wood splintered and slammed against the ancient stone walls, sending a shockwave of terror through the entire congregation. A suffocating aura of absolute power and bloody violence flooded the room, instantly silencing the whispering lords. Heavy, commanding footsteps echoed down the marble aisle, the unmistakable, terrifying clanking of dark plate armor. A man emerged from the dust of the shattered entrance, impossibly tall, broad-shouldered, and utterly terrifying. It was King Dominic, the legendary, ruthless conqueror of the Obsidian realm. He was Caleb's absolute worst nightmare and the most feared warlord on the entire divided continent. His sharp, handsome jawline was set in stone, and his dark, piercing eyes swept dangerously over the terrified room. Those lethal, captivating eyes finally locked onto me, standing all alone and abandoned at the broken altar. The haughty whispers of the nobility died instantly, quickly replaced by sheer, suffocating terror as his personal guard marched in behind him. Caleb instinctively pushed Mia behind him, his face turning deathly pale and his voice trembling with genuine fear. "King Dominic, what is the meaning of this armed intrusion in my sovereign territory?" Caleb demanded, desperately trying to sound brave. Dominic ignored him completely, treating the arrogant Duke as if he were nothing but an annoying, insignificant peasant. He walked straight down the center aisle, his heavy crimson cape dragging across the floor, his intense gaze never once leaving my face. Every single step he took in his blood-stained boots felt like a heavy war drum echoing deep within my chest. He stopped right in front of me, completely invading my personal space and shielding me from the staring crowd of cowards. He was incredibly close, smelling intoxicatingly of polished steel, dark leather, and absolute, unchecked power. He reached out, his large hand gently tracing the delicate, trembling line of my jaw, completely ignoring the heavy iron gauntlet he wore. "You are far too brilliant and beautiful to be crying over a weak, foolish boy playing dress-up," Dominic murmured, his voice a deep, rough rumble. I wasn't actually crying, but his sudden, surprisingly gentle touch sent a massive jolt of electricity straight to my core. "Take your hands off her, she is a subject of my lands," Caleb shouted, taking a foolish and reckless step forward, his hand hovering near his sword. Dominic didn't even bother to turn his head to look at the pathetic man whining behind him. He simply snapped his fingers, and dozens of his terrifying, black-clad elite warriors instantly drew their broadswords, the metallic screech filling the church. "If you speak to me again, Caleb, I will personally burn your castle to the ground before the sun rises," Dominic promised softly. Mia screamed in sheer terror, clutching Caleb's arm and dropping to her knees as the reality of their dangerous situation finally set in. Dominic looked back down at me, his dark, dangerous eyes softening in a way no one in the realm had ever witnessed before. He slowly extended his armored hand toward me, his palm open, warm, and waiting for my final decision. "Leave this pathetic excuse for a ruler behind, Lady Olenna," he offered with absolute, unwavering certainty. "Ride away with me tonight, and I will place a true, undeniable crown upon your beautiful head." He wasn't barking an arrogant order at me like a tyrant, he was offering me the ultimate, golden choice of freedom. I looked over his broad, armored shoulder at Caleb, who was practically shaking with fear in his expensive ceremonial robes. Then I looked up at the most powerful, dangerous king in the world, who was casually offering me the perfect, glorious revenge. I didn't hesitate for a single, solitary second as I looked deep into his mesmerizing eyes. I firmly placed my hand in his, instantly feeling the undeniable, overwhelming security of his strong, battle-hardened grip. "Let's go," I whispered softly, lifting my chin and stepping proudly off the carpeted altar. Dominic smiled down at me, a wicked, breathtaking expression that silently promised absolute destruction to all of my foolish enemies. He pulled me flush against his solid side, wrapping a fiercely protective, heavy arm around my waist, uncaring of the cold armor. Together, we walked confidently back down the long aisle, leaving the burning, pathetic ruins of my old life behind us forever. Not a single knight or lord in that entire cathedral dared to breathe, let alone try to stop the Obsidian King from taking his prize. As we reached the grand, shattered stone arches, Dominic paused and finally looked back at Caleb over his broad shoulder. "She is mine now," Dominic declared to the silent, trembling room, his deep voice echoing with terrifying, absolute finality. "And I will systematically slaughter anyone who ever dares to disrespect what belongs to the crown." We stepped out into the cool, dark medieval night, and I instantly knew my real story had only just begun. A massive fleet of black, gilded carriages and fierce war horses idled outside the cathedral, their armored hooves stomping impatiently. His elite royal guard, intimidating and deeply loyal, bowed their heads respectfully as we approached the royal transport. Dominic opened the heavy, wooden door of the lead carriage himself, waiting patiently for me to step inside. I climbed into the pristine, luxurious velvet interior, feeling the heavy burden of the past 2 years finally lifting off my shoulders. He climbed in smoothly beside me, the heavy door slamming shut and safely sealing us in our own private, untouchable sanctuary. I had lost a foolish, weak boy pretending to be a duke tonight, but I had gained an absolute, unstoppable emperor. Are you afraid of what comes next, my lady? Dominic asked smoothly, breaking the comfortable silence of the moving carriage. I turned my head to meet his intense, calculating gaze in the dim, ambient light of the flickering carriage lanterns. No, I answered honestly, feeling a fierce, wild new fire igniting rapidly in my warrior's blood. Good, he purred softly, his thumb lightly and possessively brushing across my knuckles. Because the whole kingdom is going to burn for what they tried to do to you tonight. The royal carriage ride from the Silverwood borders to the Obsidian Keep took several hours under the light of a pale, cold moon. The heavy, velvet-lined interior of the carriage was incredibly warm and completely silent, save for the rhythmic clopping of the massive warhorses. I looked out the small window at the impenetrable, towering black stone walls of King Dominic's legendary fortress looming in the distance. Caleb's castle was designed for throwing lavish, foolish parties, but this place was an absolute, terrifying monument to raw military power. As our heavy carriage crossed the massive wooden drawbridge, the iron portcullis rose slowly with a deafening, metallic groan. Dominic's elite vanguard knights rode closely beside us, their black armor gleaming dangerously in the flickering light of the courtyard torches. The carriage glided to a perfectly smooth halt right in front of the grand, imposing entrance of the main keep. Before his personal footman could even step forward, Dominic easily pushed the heavy wooden door open himself. He offered his large, warm hand to me again, having finally discarded his heavy iron gauntlet during our long ride. As my satin slippers touched the cold, swept cobblestone of the courtyard, a unified, deeply respectful silence fell over the gathered fortress. Hundreds of battle-hardened soldiers, elite knights, and immaculately dressed castle servants had lined up in the freezing night air. They did not stare at me with the ugly suspicion, bitter jealousy, or mocking pity I was so used to seeing in Caleb's court. Every single one of those terrifying warriors dropped to one knee, bowing their heads in ultimate, unquestioning submission to their king's companion. "Welcome home, Your Grace," a chorus of highly trained, deep voices rang out in perfect, disciplined unison across the stone yard. "Welcome home, my Lady of Battles," an old, scarred general added loudly, sending a violent shiver of absolute shock straight down my spine. I glanced up at Dominic, my heart hammering wildly against my ribs in pure, unadulterated disbelief at the title they used. They already know exactly who I am, and what I have done. I whispered, genuinely stunned by the meticulously planned grand reception. Dominic pulled me incredibly close to his side, his thumb stroking the curve of my waist with a fiercely possessive, yet gentle heat. "They have been preparing for your arrival for over 3 years, Lady Elena," he stated calmly, looking down into my widened eyes. 3 years? My breath suddenly hitched sharply in my throat as his impossible, weighty words crashed over my exhausted, battle-weary mind. I had been engaged to Caleb for 2 miserable years, foolishly bleeding on battlefields to secure a crown for a man who never loved me. Yet this terrifying, unstoppable conqueror had been patiently waiting in the shadows for me even longer than that. Dominic led me up the massive, torchlit stone steps, completely ignoring the stunned, wide-eyed look permanently fixed on my face. The heavy, custom-made oak doors opened to reveal a breathtaking, cavernous great hall illuminated by massive, roaring fireplaces. He did not lead me toward the luxurious women's quarters, as any other medieval lord would have done with a newly acquired bride. Instead, Dominic guided me firmly down a heavily guarded corridor and straight through the reinforced iron doors of his royal war room. The massive, circular chamber was dominated by a gigantic carved wooden table covered in detailed maps of the entire known continent. "Look closer, Elena," Dominic murmured softly, gesturing with his hand toward the far stone wall of the dimly lit room. Pinned to the heavy tapestries were dozens of carefully preserved, incredibly familiar parchment scrolls completely covered in my own handwriting. They were copies of every single troop movement, supply line calculation, and tactical ambush I had ever designed for Caleb's pathetic army. "How did you possibly get all of these?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper as I traced my fingers over an old battle plan. Dominic stepped up right behind me, his broad, solid chest pressing gently against my back as his unique scent of leather and spice surrounded me. I have spies in every corner of Caleb's court, but I never cared about his foolish politics, Dominic confessed, his deep voice vibrating through me. I only ever cared about the brilliant, ruthless mind of the beautiful woman hiding in his shadow. I watched you win his wars while he drank fine wine, and I waited for the exact moment you finally realized your own true, immeasurable worth. His deep words hit me like a physical blow from a broadsword, vibrating deeply within my soul with an undeniable, heavy truth. He hadn't rescued me out of random pity or a sudden, fleeting charitable whim at the cathedral tonight. This had been a highly calculated, incredibly patient hunt, and he desired my intellect just as much as he desired my body. Before I could fully process the overwhelming weight of his devotion, the heavy iron doors of the war room crashed open. An older, elegantly dressed woman stepped inside, bowing deeply and respectfully before turning her warm eyes to me. Lady Elena, my name is Matilda, and I am the head housekeeper of this fortress, she said with a warm, motherly smile. Your royal chambers are completely prepared, the hearth is blazing, and the heather flowers you favor have been placed by your bed. I stood completely frozen on the stone floor, completely overwhelmed by this meticulous and deeply personal attention to detail. During my entire time at the Silverwood Castle, Caleb never even bothered to remember my favorite flower or ensure my tent was warm. But the most powerful, dangerous, and busy king in the entire realm knew my exact, hidden personal preferences. Suddenly, a massive, heavily armored obsidian guard dragged a terrified, muddy man into the center of the war room. It was a royal messenger wearing the silver and blue colors of Caleb's house, clutching a sealed parchment in his trembling hands. He rode his horse to death to reach our gates, Your Grace, the massive guard growled, forcing the messenger to his knees. Dominic's sharp jaw tightened instantly, a dangerous, lethal energy radiating from his broad, tense shoulders as he looked at the intruder. Speak your message, worm, before I cut out your tongue, Dominic ordered, his voice deadly quiet, dangerously smooth, and terrifyingly cold. Lord Caleb demands. He demands that Lady Elena return to Silverwood immediately, the messenger stuttered, visibly shaking with absolute terror. The Eastern Lords have rebelled in her absence, and the Duke says she must come back to fix the military lines at once. A massive wave of absolute disgust washed over me just hearing Caleb's pathetic, demanding words spoken aloud. Before the messenger could even hold up the sealed letter, Dominic smoothly drew his massive, jewel-encrusted broadsword in one fluid motion. He didn't strike the man, but the razor-sharp blade sliced cleanly through the red-feathered plume of the messenger's iron helmet. The severed feathers fluttered uselessly to the cold stone floor, a terrifying, silent promise of imminent death. Dominic snatched the sealed parchment from the man's trembling hands and casually tossed it directly into the roaring fireplace. You will ride back to your pathetic master and tell him that Lady Elena is the future queen of the Obsidian realm, Dominic promised softly. Tell Caleb to prepare his burial shroud, because my armies march on Silverwood at first light, and I will leave no stone standing. Without waiting for the cowardly messenger's response, Dominic ordered his guards to throw the man out of the fortress. He turned back to me, his terrifying, murderous expression softening instantly the moment he looked at my face in the firelight. You will never have to fight a battle for a weak man ever again, Dominic vowed deeply, stepping closer and taking my hands in his. I looked at the blazing fire consuming the last pathetic piece of my old life, feeling absolutely nothing but sweet, intoxicating liberation. I smiled brightly up at my dark, dangerous emperor, fully ready to embrace the glorious, beautiful chaos of the war he was offering. The morning sun had barely crested the jagged peaks of the Obsidian Mountains when I woke in my luxurious royal chambers. Instead of the suffocating, heavy silk gowns I was always forced to wear in Silverwood, I found perfectly tailored dark leather riding armor waiting for me. Matilda had known exactly what a true woman of war required for a day of absolute conquest. I dressed quickly, feeling a thrilling surge of familiar power as I strapped a beautifully balanced silver dagger to my thigh. When I entered the grand war room, Dominic was already standing over the massive wooden table with his top military commanders. The hardened, scarred generals were fiercely debating the best strategy to breach Ironward, the heavily fortified first gate of Caleb's territory. A frontal assault with battering rams will cost us at least 1,000 good men, an old commander argued grimly, pointing at the map. The stone walls of Ironward are 30 feet thick and completely impervious to our standard catapult fire, another general added with a heavy, frustrated sigh. I walked confidently up to the tactical table, completely ignoring the sudden, surprised silence that fell over the seasoned military men. Dominic's dark eyes locked onto mine, instantly flaring with intense, burning pride as he took in my dark warrior's attire. He smoothly stepped aside, silently offering me the absolute center position of authority at the royal war table. "You will lose 1,000 men if you strike the main gates, Commander," I stated clearly, picking up a wooden marker. "But you will lose absolutely no one if you attack the western ridge just before midnight." The scarred general frowned slightly, though his deep tone remained completely respectful to my new status. "My lady, the western ridge is nothing but a sheer cliff face that cannot support a climbing siege," he countered politely. I smiled, tracing a long, deliberate line across the detailed parchment map with the tip of my wooden marker. "It is a sheer cliff on the surface, but 2 years ago, I secretly ordered Caleb's masons to hollow out the bedrock. I built a hidden smuggling tunnel deep into the mountain to move emergency grain supplies past the corrupt tax collectors. The entrance is completely concealed behind the weeping willows at the base of the gorge, wide enough for 3 heavily armed men to march shoulder to shoulder. If you send your elite vanguard through that tunnel, they will bypass the outer walls entirely and emerge directly inside the main armory." The entire war room descended into a stunned, breathless silence as the sheer brilliance of my tactical insight slowly sank in. The generals stared at the map, quickly realizing that my secret strategy was utterly flawless and completely lethal. Caleb had never even bothered to read my engineering reports, leaving him completely ignorant of the fatal weakness hidden within his own mighty defenses. Dominic slammed both of his large hands down on the table, a low, incredibly dark laugh rumbling deep within his broad chest. "Did you hear your brilliant future queen, gentlemen?" Dominic demanded, his voice ringing with absolute, terrifying authority. "We march on the western ridge at dusk, and we take Ironward before the moon reaches its peak tonight." The commanders immediately bowed deeply to me, their eyes filled with absolute reverence before they rushed out to mobilize the eager army. Once the heavy iron doors clicked shut, leaving us entirely alone, Dominic rounded the table with predatory, fluid grace. He didn't say a single word as he grabbed my waist, lifting me effortlessly onto the edge of the carved wooden table. His lips crashed down onto mine, fierce, consuming, and burning with a wild, unrestrained adoration that stole my breath. I wrapped my arms tightly around his broad, armored shoulders, kissing him back with every ounce of passion I possessed. "You are the most magnificent creature to ever walk this earth, Elena," he murmured roughly against my lips, his breathing heavy. "You handed me a bloodless victory today, and tonight, I am going to hand you the burning keys to Caleb's fortress." By nightfall, the massive obsidian army had moved silently through the dense, freezing forests without raising a single enemy alarm. I rode proudly beside Dominic at the head of the vanguard, seated comfortably on a massive, terrifying black warhorse. Just as I had promised, the hidden tunnel behind the weeping willows was completely unguarded by Caleb's lazy, incompetent soldiers. Dominic's elite assassins slipped seamlessly into the dark cavern, completely bypassing the massive, 30-foot stone walls of the fortress. Within less than an hour, the heavy iron gates of Ironward slowly creaked open from the inside without a single warning bell ringing. There was no massive, bloody battle, and absolutely no obsidian soldiers lost their lives in the cold mud. Caleb's terrified garrison surrendered instantly, dropping their swords in pure shock the moment they saw King Dominic riding calmly through their gates. We rode victoriously into the conquered courtyard, the black banners of the Obsidian Realm already flying high above the stone watchtowers. I looked at the captured fortress, feeling a deep, satisfying closure as the first piece of my grand revenge fell perfectly into place. Dominic brought his massive horse close to mine, reaching out with his leather-clad hand to gently brush a stray lock of hair from my flushed cheek. "One fortress down, my beautiful, ruthless strategist," he promised smoothly, his eyes shining with dangerous, thrilling promises in the moonlight. "Tomorrow, we take the rest of his pathetic kingdom, and I will make Caleb watch as I place his stolen crown directly upon your head." The morning sun illuminated the terrifying might of the Obsidian army as we completely surrounded the high walls of Silverwood Castle. Thousands of heavily armored knights sat atop their restless warhorses, completely silent and waiting for King Dominic's final command. Inside those grey stone walls, I knew sheer panic was currently tearing Caleb's entire arrogant court apart. Word of Ironwood's flawless, overnight fall had undoubtedly reached the capital long before the dawn broke. The Eastern lords had already abandoned Caleb's banners, leaving him trapped like a frightened, pathetic rat in his own keep. Dominic sat casually on his massive black destrier beside me, looking like a bored god of war waiting to be entertained. Suddenly, the heavy iron portcullis of the main gate slowly began to rise with a pathetic, grinding screech. There was no glorious charge of brave knights, and there was no defiant blowing of silver war horns to greet our arrival. Instead, a small, cowardly procession rode out beneath the dark archway carrying a massive white flag of truce. At the head of the pathetic group was Caleb, wearing his glittering, jeweled ceremonial armor that had never seen a single day of actual combat. Riding closely beside him on a gentle white mare was Mia, her face deathly pale and heavily stained with terrified tears. They halted their horses a respectful distance away, clearly paralyzed by the terrifying sea of black armor surrounding them. Caleb swallowed hard, his arrogant eyes darting nervously toward Dominic before finally landing desperately on me. "Elena, please, we must speak as reasonable adults and end this madness," Caleb shouted, his voice cracking slightly under the immense pressure. I urged my powerful warhorse forward a few paces, resting my leather-gloved hand casually on the pommel of my saddle. "You are speaking to the future queen of the Obsidian Realm, boy," Dominic's deep, magical voice boomed across the silent battlefield. "You will address her with the ultimate respect that your pathetic, fleeting life now depends on." Caleb flinched violently, quickly bowing his head in a humiliating display of submission before his own remaining, watching soldiers. "My lady Elena, I beg of you to call off this senseless, bloody siege," Caleb pleaded, attempting to sound like a wronged victim. "I know you are simply angry about the wedding, but destroying your own homeland is sheer madness." I let out a cold, sharp laugh that echoed clearly over the quiet, freezing valley. "Silverwood was never my homeland, Caleb. It was merely a difficult project I built to see if a fool could be made into a duke. You proved to me yesterday at the altar that the project was an absolute, irredeemable failure." Caleb's face flushed with angry red embarrassment, but his crippling fear kept his trembling hand far away from his sword. "I admit I made a foolish mistake at the altar, Elena," he tried again, employing his most manipulative, charming tone. "Mia is fragile, and I was temporarily blinded by a fleeting passion, but you have always been my true, equal partner. Come back to the castle with me, and we can rule together just like we always planned." Beside him, Mia let out a loud, pathetic sob, completely shattered by his immediate willingness to throw her away to save his own life. "Caleb, how could you say that after everything you promised me?" Mia cried, reaching out to grab his armored arm. He violently shoved her hand away, glaring at the weeping girl with pure, unfiltered hatred. "Shut your mouth, you stupid peasant, you are the exact reason my kingdom is falling apart," he hissed venomously. I watched the pathetic scene unfold with absolute disgust, feeling deeply relieved that I had escaped this toxic, spineless man. Your kingdom fell apart the exact second you let go of my hand, Caleb, I stated, my voice ringing with cold, absolute truth. Dominic urged his massive warhorse forward, stopping his terrifying beast mere inches from Caleb's trembling mount. The conqueror looked down at the pathetic Duke with eyes as dark and cold as a frozen, forgotten grave. Did you honestly think you could insult my queen and simply apologize to make the consequences go away? Dominic asked softly. Caleb trembled so violently that his polished armor rattled, entirely unable to meet the terrifying, lethal gaze of the Obsidian King. I demand your absolute, unconditional surrender right here, right now, I announced, taking full control of the final negotiation. You will open your gates, lay down all your weapons, and officially renounce your false claim to this dukedom. Caleb stared at me in pure horror, finally realizing that I was not a weak woman who could be easily swayed by fake apologies. And if I refuse your demands, he asked, attempting one last, pathetic bluff to save his crumbling pride. Dominic smiled, a wicked, blood-chilling expression that promised complete and total annihilation for everyone inside the walls. If you refuse, I will personally burn your castle to ash, slaughter your garrison, and mount your head on a rusted spike before dinner, Dominic replied calmly. The absolute certainty in Dominic's voice completely broke the last remaining shreds of Caleb's manufactured courage. With a defeated, humiliating sob, Caleb slowly dismounted from his horse and fell to his knees in the cold, wet mud. He unbuckled his expensive, jeweled sword belt and laid it respectfully on the ground before my horse's hooves. Mia followed him down into the dirt, weeping uncontrollably as the entire Silverwood garrison watched their rulers completely surrender without a fight. I looked down at the weak man I had once thought I loved, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, empty indifference. Dominic reached out from his saddle, his large, warm hand covering mine in a gesture of profound respect and shared victory. The castle is yours, my queen, Dominic murmured, loud enough for both armies to hear his absolute devotion. I raised my chin, signaling for the Obsidian vanguard to march forward and claim our newly conquered prize. We rode through the massive iron gates of Silverwood Castle not as welcomed guests, but as undisputed, absolute conquerors. The same wealthy lords and ladies who had mocked me at the wedding yesterday were now trembling in the muddy courtyard. Dominic led me straight into the cavernous great hall, his heavy, metal-plated boots echoing with terrifying, unchecked authority. He did not arrogantly take the conquered duke's carved wooden throne for himself. Instead, he firmly guided me up the carpeted stone steps and gently seated me upon the plush velvet cushions. Heavily armed Obsidian guards brutally dragged Caleb and Mia into the center of the massive room in heavy iron chains. Caleb's expensive ceremonial armor had been completely stripped away, leaving him in nothing but a dirty, torn peasant's tunic. Mia was weeping violently, her delicate blonde hair matted with mud and her sickeningly smug attitude completely destroyed. The cowardly noblemen who had eagerly betrayed me yesterday fell to their knees, desperately begging for my sudden royal mercy. I looked down at the pathetic, groveling crowd, feeling the absolute, intoxicating rush of true, unyielding power. Yesterday, you foolishly told me I was absolutely nothing without the protection of the Silverwood banner, I reminded them coldly. Today, I am the only one deciding if your pathetic, treacherous houses survive the coming winter. Caleb looked up at me with desperate, bloodshot eyes, finally realizing the monumental scale of his fatal mistake. He had foolishly traded a brilliant queen for a useless, crying girl, and it had cost him his entire ancestral kingdom. Dominic suddenly stepped forward, instantly commanding the terrified attention of every single person in the massive room. He reached beneath his dark crimson cloak and pulled out a breathtaking object that made the entire room gasp in pure shock. It was the legendary obsidian crown, forged from ancient dark steel and encrusted with priceless, glowing blood rubies. The most feared, ruthless conqueror in the entire world slowly dropped to one knee right in front of my wooden throne. You have conquered this castle, Lady Elena, but you conquered my dark heart long ago, Dominic declared loudly. Marry me tonight, and let us rule this entire divided continent together as absolute, undeniable equals. Caleb let out a strangled, pathetic cry of pure agony, forced to watch the woman he discarded become an almighty empress. I smiled warmly down at the magnificent, dangerous king who had freely given me the entire world on a silver platter. Yes, my king, I answered confidently, leaning forward as he gently placed the heavy, glorious crown upon my head. The heavy iron chains clanked loudly against the cold stone floor as Caleb and Mia were unceremoniously dragged away by the royal guards. I did not feel a single ounce of pity as their desperate, pathetic screams slowly faded down the dark spiral staircase leading to the deepest dungeons. They would spend the rest of their miserable, pathetic lives in the freezing dark, completely forgotten by the very people they once ruled. With the traitors finally removed from my sight, the suffocating tension in the great hall instantly evaporated into thin air. Dominic dismissed the trembling courtiers with a sharp, authoritative wave of his hand, leaving us entirely alone in the cavernous space. He did not force me into another exhausting, hours-long cathedral ceremony surrounded by fake, gossiping nobility. Instead, he gently took my hand and led me out onto the highest stone balcony of the castle, standing directly under the infinite canvas of the starlit sky. The cool midnight wind whipped his dark crimson cloak around us as he carefully held both of my hands in his own. I do not need a priest to validate my eternal devotion to you, Elena, he murmured smoothly, his dark eyes reflecting the brilliant stars above. Before the old gods and the new, I swear my life, my sword, and my absolute empire to you until my very last breath. His solemn, unbroken vow carried more weight and profound truth than 1,000 whispered promises from a weak, dishonest boy. I looked up at my magnificent king, my heart overflowing with a fierce, untamed love that I had never truly allowed myself to feel before. And I swear my loyalty, my brilliant mind, and my entire heart to you, Dominic, I replied gracefully, sealing our eternal pact in the quiet night. He smiled, a breathtakingly tender expression that completely transformed his dangerous, battle-hardened features into something heartbreakingly beautiful. Without another word, he scooped me up effortlessly into his strong, muscular arms as if I weighed absolutely nothing. I rested my head against his broad chest, listening to the steady, reassuring rhythm of his powerful heartbeat as he carried me through the quiet castle. He bypassed the lavish guest quarters and walked purposefully toward the Grand Master suite that had once foolishly belonged to Caleb. When he kicked the heavy oak doors open, I gasped in pure surprise at the incredible, thoughtful transformation of the massive room. Caleb's gaudy, tasteless gold decorations had been completely stripped away and burned in the grand fireplace. The royal chamber was now elegantly draped in rich, dark emerald velvets and deep obsidian black silks, perfectly reflecting our combined reign. Hundreds of thick white candles cast a warm, romantic glow across the massive four-poster bed and the scattered, fragrant white rose petals. He set me down incredibly gently on the edge of the soft mattress, his large hands resting carefully on my waist. The very same man who had ruthlessly slaughtered entire armies just hours ago now touched me with the delicate reverence of handling fragile glass. You were forced to endure a humiliating, heartbreaking nightmare on your last wedding night, Dominic whispered softly, his rough thumb tracing my jawline. Tonight, I am going to completely erase every single terrible memory that pathetic coward ever gave you. He reached up and carefully removed the heavy obsidian crown from my head, setting the priceless artifact aside on a velvet pillow. I shivered involuntarily as his warm, calloused fingers began to slowly unlace the heavy leather straps of my dark riding armor. Every single brush of his knuckles against my heated skin sent violent, intoxicating sparks of electricity shooting straight to my core. He worshipped every inch of my body with a slow, agonizingly sweet devotion that made my breath catch sharply in my throat. There was absolutely no rush, no selfish urgency, and no arrogant demands like I had experienced in my miserable past. Dominic carefully stripped away my heavy armor, removing both the physical leather and the emotional walls I had built to survive. When his lips finally met my bare, trembling skin, I let out a soft, breathless moan that echoed loudly in the quiet, candlelit chamber. He kissed my faded battle scars, he praised my brilliant mind, and he made me feel like the most desired, precious woman in the entire world. As we finally tangled together in the dark silk sheets, the heavy burden of the last 2 years completely vanished from my weary soul. I was no longer the unappreciated shadow, the discarded bride, or the lonely strategist fighting for a thankless cause. I was Elena, the fiercely loved and universally feared empress of the Obsidian realm. And as my conqueror pulled me closer into the blazing heat of his protective embrace, I knew I had finally found my true home. The morning sunlight filtered heavily through the rich velvet drapes, casting a warm golden glow across the tangled silk sheets of our marital bed. I woke up feeling completely reborn, the lingering, bitter exhaustion of the past 2 years finally burned away by Dominic's consuming passion. My magnificent conqueror was already awake, his heavily scarred, muscular back resting against the carved wooden headboard as he gently stroked my silver blonde hair. Before we could even share a quiet, peaceful morning kiss, the heavy oak doors of our royal bedchamber echoed with 3 urgent, frantic knocks. Matilda's muffled, nervous voice called out from the dark hallway, apologizing profusely for disturbing our sacred peace so early in the morning. She quickly reported that an arrogant emissary from the Northern Coalition had just arrived at the castle gates, demanding an immediate royal audience. The Northern Barons were Caleb's former, treacherous allies, a group of greedy, ruthless warlords who constantly tested the unprotected borders of Silverwood. They clearly believed that with Caleb deposed and the terrifying Obsidian King distracted by his new bride, the realm was ripe for a swift, easy invasion. Dominic growled deeply, a terrifying sound of pure, predatory annoyance, and began to reach for his heavy steel sword resting by the ornate nightstand. I gently placed my bare hand over his scarred chest, stopping him with a slow, wicked smile that silently promised absolute destruction. We did not rush to dress in a blind panic, nor did we plan to hide like cowards behind the safety of the reinforced castle walls. Matilda helped me into a breathtaking gown of dark crimson silk, tightly cinched with a rigid corset of pure, hardened black leather. Dominic carefully secured the legendary obsidian crown upon my head, his dark eyes burning with fierce, undeniable pride as he looked at his empress. When we finally descended the grand marble staircase and entered the cavernous great hall, the entire gathered court fell into a stunned, absolute silence. The emissary standing arrogantly in the center of the room was a massive, scarred brute wearing the blue and silver crest of the treacherous Northern Coalition. He sneered openly as I walked into the room, clearly expecting a fragile, weeping girl who had been violently forced into a warlord's bed. He did not even bother to bow his head, a blatant, foolish insult that instantly made every single obsidian guard in the room draw their steel blades. Dominic raised a single, authoritative hand from his throne, instantly silencing his enraged men so we could hear the fool's final, pathetic words. The emissary proudly puffed out his heavy armored chest, completely blind to the lethal danger radiating from the royal dais he stood before. My lords of the north demand that the Obsidian army immediately retreat across the border before sunset, the emissary barked, his rough voice echoing loudly. They also demand that Lady Elena be handed over to our custody, as she is a valuable strategic asset of the former Silverwood Alliance. A heavy, suffocating tension instantly gripped the massive stone hall, thick enough to be easily cut with a freshly sharpened dagger. Dominic did not scream, throw a temper tantrum, or fly into a blind, uncontrollable rage at the blatant disrespect shown to his new wife. Instead, he leaned back comfortably in his massive carved chair, turning his dark, thoroughly amused eyes entirely toward me. He was offering me the absolute floor, allowing me to handle this pathetic, empty threat like the true, undisputed ruler I was born to be. I slowly stood up from my velvet throne, my heavy crimson silk skirts trailing elegantly over the cold stone steps as I gracefully descended. I walked right up to the massive northern emissary, stopping only a few inches away from his dirty, rusted chainmail armor. He was a full head taller than me, but he suddenly looked incredibly small and nervous under my cold, calculating, and utterly fearless stare. "You arrogant northern fools truly believe you can march your pathetic peasant army to my gates and demand my surrender?" I asked softly, my voice dripping with poison. "My lords have 10,000 heavily armed men camped at the Whispering Gorge right now," the emissary threatened, desperately trying to regain his false bravado. I let out a slow, chilling laugh that made the hulking emissary physically flinch and take a cautious, cowardly step backward. "I know exactly where your pathetic army is camped, because I was the one who quietly diverted your scouts into that narrow valley," I revealed smoothly. The brute's eyes widened in pure, unadulterated shock as the terrifying reality of his situation finally began to dawn on his slow mind. "Did your foolish commanders really think the Silverwood grain shipments they stole yesterday were left completely unguarded by simple accident?" I continued ruthlessly. "I personally ordered my apothecaries to lace every single sack of that flour with slow-acting nightshade before we even took this castle yesterday." The emissary choked heavily on his own breath, his weathered face turning completely pale as the devastating truth crashed into his limited mind. "By the time your 10,000 men wake up this morning, half of them will be dead in their tents, and the other half will be entirely too weak to lift a sword." I turned my back on the trembling man, walking slowly and gracefully back up the carpeted steps to my waiting, magnificent king. "Your pathetic rebellion is already over, and your treacherous lords will be buried in the very gorge they thought would be their glorious staging ground," I declared loudly. Dominic stood up, his massive, imposing frame towering over the great hall as he drew his legendary, jewel-encrusted broadsword in one incredibly fluid motion. The sharp, metallic ring of the dark steel echoed like a terrifying death knell in the uncomfortably quiet, crowded room. "My queen has generously shown you her brilliant mind, but now I will show you my absolute wrath," Dominic promised, his voice cold and completely lethal. He swung the heavy blade with terrifying, blinding speed, severing the emissary's head from his thick shoulders before the man could even scream. The headless body collapsed to the cold stone floor with a heavy, wet thud, serving as a stark, bloody warning to anyone who dared question our combined rule. I did not flinch, scream, or look away from the violent execution, feeling only a deep, profound satisfaction that our borders were finally secure. Dominic carefully wiped his bloody blade with a velvet cloth, his dark, dangerous eyes completely focused on my completely calm, proud face. "Send that fool's bleeding head back to the northern barons in a cheap wooden box," Dominic casually ordered his elite, black-clad guards. "Tell them that the Obsidian Empress sends her absolute regards, and she expects their immediate, unconditional surrender by nightfall." He reached out and pulled me fiercely into his armored side, kissing the top of my head in front of the entire, completely terrified court. Together, we walked out onto the grand stone balcony, looking down at the massive, unstoppable army that now answered directly to both of our commands. I was no longer just a brilliant strategist hiding in the dark, and I was definitely not a discarded bride waiting to be saved by a prince. I was the undisputed, terrifying ruler of the continent, and the entire world was finally going to learn exactly what happened when you crossed me. The air in the deepest levels of the castle dungeons was thick with the suffocating stench of decay, damp stone, and broken dreams. Torches flickered weakly against the weeping walls as I walked down the narrow, spiraling stairs, my heavy silk skirts whispering against the cold granite. Dominic walked closely beside me, his hand resting possessively on the small of my back, his presence a warm shield against the encroaching darkness. We stopped in front of the most secure, iron-barred cell at the very end of the lightless corridor. Inside, curled in a pathetic heap in the corner of a straw-covered floor, sat the man who had once been the center of my entire world. Caleb's face was smeared with filth, his expensive wedding tunic now nothing but a collection of gray, stinking rags. Across from him, Mia was frantically scratching at the stone walls, her once beautiful blonde hair matted with grime and lice. The moment they heard the heavy, rhythmic clanking of the guard's armor, they both scrambled toward the iron bars like desperate, starving animals. Caleb's eyes widened in pure, agonizing shock the second he recognized me standing there in my glorious obsidian crown. "Elena! Oh God, Elena, thank the heavens you've come for me!" Caleb cried out, his voice a hoarse, pathetic rasp. He reached his trembling, dirty hands through the bars, desperately trying to touch the hem of my pristine crimson gown. Dominic's jaw tightened instantly, and he stepped forward with a low, predatory growl that made Caleb recoil in absolute terror. "Do not dare to reach your filthy hands toward the Empress of this realm," Dominic warned, his voice like the grinding of tectonic plates. Caleb collapsed back into the mud of his cell, his body shaking with uncontrollable sobs of regret and cowardice. "I was mad, Elena. I was possessed by a dark spell, I swear it," Caleb pleaded, his eyes darting frantically. "It was Mia. She manipulated me, she tricked me into thinking I loved her just to steal your brilliant mind for our house." Mia let out a shrill, hysterical scream of pure rage, launching herself at Caleb and clawing at his sunken face with her broken nails. "You lying coward! You were the one who promised me a crown if I helped you get rid of her," she shrieked venomously. I watched the two of them tear at each other like rabid dogs in a pit, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, heavy sense of finality. "You didn't need a spell to betray me, Caleb. You simply needed a mirror to show you how small and weak you truly were," I stated calmly. Caleb looked up at me, tears carving clean streaks through the thick dirt on his pathetic, hollowed cheeks. "Please, Elena, for the sake of our childhood, for the sake of the summers we spent in the rose gardens, let me out," he whimpered. "I will be your slave, your footman, anything. Just don't leave me in this dark, God-forsaken hole." Dominic reached for the hilt of his jewel-encrusted broadsword, his knuckles white with the intense urge to end Caleb's pathetic life. I gently placed my hand on his muscular arm, shaking my head slowly as I looked deep into my husband's burning, protective eyes. "No, Dominic. Death is a mercy that a man of his insignificance does not deserve to receive from your noble blade," I said softly. I turned back to the trembling, broken man who had once stood at the altar and told me I was nothing without him. "You will not die today, Caleb, and you will certainly not be allowed to stay in this castle as even a servant," I announced with absolute authority. "At dawn, you and your mistress will be loaded into an iron cage and transported to the eternal mines of the frozen north. You will spend every remaining second of your miserable lives digging for or in the bone-chilling dark, until your bodies finally surrender to the earth." Mia let out a long, haunting wail of despair, collapsing onto the freezing floor as the weight of her eternal sentence finally crushed her. Caleb simply stared at me, his mouth hanging open in a silent, broken scream of pure, unadulterated realization. He had lost the only woman who ever truly saw his potential, and now he would spend eternity in the cold, remembering the warmth he threw away. "Let's go, Dominic," I whispered, turning my back on the pathetic shadows of my past without a single, solitary regret. We walked back up the stairs, leaving the sounds of their weeping and mutual hatred far behind us in the bowels of the earth. As we stepped out into the brilliant, blinding afternoon sun of the main courtyard, a massive cheer erupted from the thousands of gathered citizens. They were shouting my name, their voices rising like a powerful, unstoppable tide that echoed across the entire conquered valley. Dominic pulled me close, his dark eyes shining with a deep, infinite love and a fierce, unyielding pride that made my heart soar. The girl who was discarded at the altar was dead and buried, and in her place stood a woman who had seized her own glorious destiny. The Obsidian Empire was finally at peace, and for the first time in my life, I was truly, undeniably free. The morning of the grand imperial coronation broke over the capital with a brilliant, golden sunrise that seemed to set the entire sky ablaze. I stood silently before the massive, gilded mirror in my royal bedchamber, watching my loyal ladies in waiting carefully adjust the heavy crimson velvet of my gown. Just a few short weeks ago, I had worn innocent white silk to pledge my eternal loyalty to a weak, treacherous boy who never truly valued my brilliant mind. Today, I was draped in the dark, imposing colors of a conquering empress, preparing to claim undisputed dominion over the entire known world. There were absolutely no tears of sorrow or anxiety threatening to ruin my flawless appearance this beautiful morning. Every single scar on my soul had been completely healed by the burning, unconditional devotion of the terrifying warlord who now called me his absolute equal. The heavy oak doors swung open smoothly, and Dominic stepped into the room looking like a magnificent, dark god of war descended directly from the heavens. He wore ceremonial black armor accented with deep crimson silk, the legendary obsidian sword resting comfortably at his broad, muscular hip. He did not wait for the servants to finish their tasks, simply waving them away with a gentle but highly authoritative flick of his leather-gloved hand. He walked up behind me, wrapping his strong, familiar arms tightly around my waist and resting his sharp chin on my shoulder as we looked into the mirror together. "You are the most breathtaking, terrifyingly beautiful creature to ever grace this brutal earth," he murmured softly, his deep voice vibrating wonderfully against my neck. "And you are the only man in this entire realm worthy of standing at my side," I replied with absolute certainty, leaning back into his solid, comforting warmth. We walked out of the royal chambers together, our hands tightly clasped as we made our way down the sweeping marble staircase toward the cavernous Great Hall. Unlike that horrific wedding day in my past, I did not walk down the aisle alone while the surrounding crowds whispered cruel, mocking insults behind my back. Today, thousands of elite knights, loyal lords, and terrified visiting dignitaries bowed their heads to the floor in profound, trembling reverence as we gracefully passed by. The massive throne room had been completely transformed into a breathtaking sanctuary of dark royal banners, glowing torches, and endless walls of fresh white roses. The scent of the sweet flowers mixed perfectly with the sharp, metallic tang of polished armor, a beautiful representation of our united, unbreakable reign. At the very end of the long, velvet-lined aisle stood not one, but two massive thrones carved flawlessly from solid, impenetrable black stone. There was no frail, ancient priest waiting there to bind us with fragile, easily broken religious vows or archaic traditions. Dominic had explicitly declared to the continent that our sacred union and our ultimate authority were far beyond the reach of any mortal church or kingdom. We reached the elevated royal dais, and Dominic turned fully to face me, his dark, dangerous eyes completely softening with an overwhelming, infinite tide of love. He reached for the velvet cushion held safely by his highest-ranking general, lifting the legendary, ruby-encrusted obsidian crown with his large, calloused hands. The entire massive hall fell into a breathless, expectant silence, the collective gaze of the continent securely locked onto this historic, world-shifting moment. "You were born to rule this world, Elena, and it is my greatest honor in this life to ensure everyone knows your terrifying brilliance," Dominic declared loudly. He didn't hesitate for a single, fleeting second as he gently, reverently placed the heavy, magnificent crown directly onto my braided silver blonde hair. "Long live the Empress!" Dominic roared, his magical, commanding voice echoing off the ancient stone walls like a massive clap of rolling thunder. "Long live the Empress!" The thousands of gathered warriors and nobles screamed in perfect, deafening unison, drawing their broadswords and raising them high into the air. The sheer volume of their absolute, unquestioning loyalty shook the very foundations of the castle, a glorious sound that I knew would echo through history. Dominic pulled me fiercely into his massive chest, kissing me with a wild, unrestrained passion that completely ignored the thousands of respectfully watching eyes. I kissed my dark conqueror back with every ounce of fire in my soul, sealing our ultimate victory for the entire mortal world to clearly witness. Later that evening, after the lavish feasts and endless, exhausting celebrations had finally quieted down, we stood completely alone on the highest balcony of the keep. The vast, sleeping city stretched out beautifully below us, a peaceful, newly prosperous empire that we had forged seamlessly together from the ashes of my broken past. The cool night wind played gently with the heavy crimson fabric of my gown, but I felt absolutely no chill while safely wrapped in Dominic's strong, protective arms. I looked up at the glittering, endless canopy of stars, my mind briefly flashing back to the horrific moment Caleb had dropped my trembling hand at the altar. I had foolishly believed my entire life was completely destroyed in that agonizing, deeply humiliating second of ultimate, public betrayal. Now, standing proudly beside the most powerful, devoted man in the entire world, I finally understood the beautiful, perfect irony of my twisted fate. Caleb abandoning me was not a tragic, life-ending curse, but the greatest, most profound blessing the universe could have ever possibly given me. He had cowardly intended to throw me into the dirt to serve a lesser woman, but his foolish betrayal had inadvertently launched me straight to the undisputed pinnacle of the world. I rested my head peacefully against Dominic's armored shoulder, listening to the steady, comforting beat of his massive, loving heart in the quiet night. The discarded, weeping bride was nothing but a distant, forgotten ghost that had been permanently buried in the ruins of Silverwood. The glorious, terrifying, and eternally romantic reign of the Obsidian Empress had finally, truly begun.